A new documentary is stirring the pot in D.C. in a major way. Biden's top economic advisor, Jared Bernstein, is apparently uncertain about how our monetary system works, along with other mainstream economists.
The U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language and concepts are just confusing.
Mainstream economists not understanding the monetary system isn't the only reason the film is raising eyebrows. It's centered around answering the question asked time and again in D.C. You want health care, student loan debt cancellation, Social Security? How are you going to pay for it? It seems people are interested in the answer. Within one day of its release, Finding the Money rose to #1 on the documentary charts of Apple TV.
Of course, people are interested because every few years we are threatened with a looming government shutdown because Congress is in a fight over budgeting. And inevitably, we hear about how we have to cut the national debt and reduce the deficit. The movie's star, Stephanie Kelton, has angered some of the most powerful economists and policymakers in the country by arguing convincingly that they've got it all wrong. Here to discuss the film's impact is director Maren Poitras. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's start with just a little bit on that viral clip. I know we don't want to rub it in too much, but I mean, the question he was asked, of course, is why does the government borrow money if they can print their own? Was there anyone that you talked to for the film that had a convincing answer?
Well, no, and I think that's the exact point, is it's not about one person, and it's not about an aberration. I think what I was trying to explore in the film was, again, I came across this kind of small group of heterodox economists, or renegade economists who are making some striking, assertions that the mainstream of the field of economics might be missing some fundamental assumptions around the nature of money, where money comes from, and therefore the nature of the national debt and what the national debt is, what the federal government can afford. And so these were bold assumptions, and as a filmmaker, as a journalist, I wanted to explore them and kind of tease out the conflict there and the controversy, because there is a lot of that. And the mainstream will point to this smaller group referred to as modern monetary theory as saying, oh, this is voodoo economics, this is a crackpot theory. But they start from the simple premise or the simple observation that the federal government is the issuer of the currency, of the US dollar, and has been since the Constitution, Congress. So starting from that basic premise, my question was, could it be that mainstream economics hasn't integrated that observation into their field, into their models, into how they predict and understand what the national debt is and what the federal government can afford? And so I wanted to try to find out for myself, what do mainstream economists think? Can they show me exactly where this renegade or smaller heterodox theory goes wrong? And so you see some of that in the film, and I tried to talk to the broadest range of economists that I could. And so that includes Jared Bernstein and many others. And what was so striking for me and so educational for me in that clip was to see that he hadn't been asked that question before from another journalist in the textbooks, or himself. He hadn't asked that question to himself. And that's what I think is the most interesting and the most educational for me was, could it be that kind of a basic question hasn't been asked, or, because I always thought, okay, I'll go to the mainstream economists and they'll simply explain to me why this small group is wrong. But I didn't get that. I didn't get a convincing explanation of someone showing me specifically where the theory goes wrong. And I think that's what you see the characters in the film go through as well. Stephanie Kelton in the film starts out skeptical. Everyone I met who's come to the theory has started out skeptical, myself included, right? Because it bucks conventional wisdom. We're taught the federal government, in order to spend, has to go out and find the money. It has to tax and it has to borrow in order to spend. This theory, modern monetary theory, is saying it's the other way around. There's a different order that's going on here. And so if we go back to look at that, what does that mean for the bigger ramifications of what is the debt and what can the federal government afford? And so, long story short, I think Stephanie in the film and myself are starting to be more convinced once we look into the actual operations. We look at talk to the Federal Reserve and the Treasury of how does the operations occur, what are the funding mechanisms and the order of operations of how our monetary system currently operates. And when you dive into that, I think you get different answers and maybe what's included in the textbooks. So now the question is, can we change the textbooks?
Right, and we need to. I studied public policy at Brown University. We didn't touch money creation, which is an essential component of a growing economy. Where is money entering it? From the private sector, from the federal government? Foreign debt would be the other option, the foreign sector. And really what this documentary does is fill in that blank. That's not just a blank in most of the public's minds, but honestly most of the academics' minds as well, which is why I think mainstream economists don't have answers to these questions about MMT, because it's filling a gap in the field of economics and public policy. So can you tell us about just the importance of the magnitude of what's exposed in this film, turning the conventional wisdom on its head and offering, in my opinion, a very accessible explanation?
Well, thank you. And yes, I think, the ramifications are quite large. And that was why, I had to try to take it on, because it's not just an academic debate that's hidden, in academia that can be hashed out over there. It's like this affects all of our daily lives and really the future of the planet. When we're thinking about climate and we're always asked, how can we afford this climate spending or the trillions of dollars we need? There's no government in the world, according to John Kerry, who has the money to spend to avert climate change. And so not only that, but just how can we actually budget? How can the government budget more responsibly? And that means looking at our real resources. So I think the real ramification here is that we're budgeting for the wrong thing. We're thinking that money is the real scarce resource itself that we need to budget and conserve, when really there are, of course, limits, right? The government must prioritize, it must still budget. But if we're budgeting for money, money is just the organizing tool of the real resources. The real resources in our economy are what we need to be budgeting for and conserving for future generations. We hear the national debt is this terrible burden for future generations, but what are we really leaving them in terms of real wealth and real resources? And that's what the government needs to be considering and budgeting for. And of course, that's tied to inflation and inflationary limits. So the federal government has a responsibility to budget, and any new spending proposal should be analyzed for its inflationary potential and its real resource use, and those are linked. And so what I think this school is trying to bring is actually a more sophisticated or a better public debate around how can we budget more responsibly, how can we ensure that we're preventing inflation, and that's tied to real resources and real resource use. So those are the limits we need to be thinking about. But when we're budgeting in terms of money, we miss spending that may be a lot more affordable, that our society can afford, on a societal level. So what's exciting to me is it could mean that certain types of spending that maybe cost a lot of dollars but don't cost a lot of resources become more affordable. So certain types of spending on climate or on employing people who are currently unemployed to restore forests and wetlands and fisheries, that's preserving and increasing our real resource capacity, the real resources that we have. And it doesn't cost society, to employ people who are currently unemployed and create this net benefit. Sure, some dollars are spent, but we've net gained as a society, and I think that translates to other aspects of our economy as well. So healthcare, is Medicare For All actually, does it cost society less overall in terms of real resource use, labor use? And so if we're moving some dollars onto the federal budget, that doesn't necessarily, that actually means it could be disinflationary or deflationary if we move to a system that uses less resources. So Medicare For All, it costs society overall less. So I think that's really a different perspective, because we're just focused on the dollars. We think that's a lot of government spending, but we have to look at the societal perspective and spending overall in the economy. So it's healthcare, it's energy, it's our public transit system. A public transit system that's fast, free, and reliable costs society a lot less resources than the current, car infrastructure that we have and that we've invested in. And you can look at, energy utilities and public provisioning of green renewable energy that can cost consumers less, right? And if the way we do it today with private energy utilities, they have no incentive to invest in the green renewable energy because they don't want to, bring costs down for consumers. Then that would eat into their profits, right? They want to keep prices going up. So if government is able to spend some dollars to provide, good, clean, renewable energy, we can look at how do we bring costs down for everyone and do things more efficiently. So the point is it is a bit of a paradigm shift in how we have to think about federal government budgeting, and hopefully in a more sophisticated way.
Stephanie's better at doing this than me, but I always say, do you feel better about dollars entering the economy from a huge private bank with a charter versus the federal government? Because it's really going to be this big entity, and a lot of those guys, in my view, are on the same team. But, Stephanie has been so essential in addressing a lot of the stuff about MMT that's out there. Like you guys are saying, we can just print money endlessly and there are no constraints. Can you talk about her voice and mission?
Yeah, and so, right, that's kind of the misperception when I went out to go talk to economists. Where does MMT go wrong? And they'll say, well, MMT says you can print infinite amounts of money and never cause inflation. So that's not what MMT says, so that's not an useful debate or an useful critique if you're critiquing that statement, right? MMT will say you can print or you create as many dollars as you want, but there are consequences. You will run into inflationary and real resource limits, and that's what you need to be thinking about, not the national debt or a debt crisis or spiking interest rates, as what we see in the textbook and what we see, hearing after hearing on the Hill is, the dangers of the national debt and how CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, analyzes legislation. It only looks at how many dollars does it add to the federal debt and projects that out over time and fears of a debt crisis. But if we step back and break down, starting from the assumption that the federal government is the issuer of the currency, what is the national debt then, right? And that goes back to the original question. And rather than the national debt being a record of the number of dollars the federal government has borrowed, it's really more accurate to say the national debt is a record of the number of dollars the federal government has created and spent into the economy and not yet taxed back. So it's the dollars that we hold in our pocket and in our bank accounts. And then the government voluntarily offers to issue bonds. But the key is that it's voluntary to switch out those dollars for interest-bearing dollars, which you can call treasury bonds or bills or notes. And the important distinction that MMT is able to make is that that's not a financial necessity. It's not what we should call a borrowing operation that they're not going out to find money to borrow in order to spend, but it's a voluntary operation where they've already spent. So that goes back to the order. If you're the issuer of the currency, before anyone can have dollars to tax, for the government to tax or to borrow from, where do those dollars come from in the first instance, right? And that's the important question that we kind of we live in the moment today, and we see the taxing and the borrowing happening, and you can kind of get confused. But if you go back to the beginning, maybe you can see the order a little more clearly. And in the film, we bring in a lot of historical examples, and so I think that's important just to clarify the order. If the government has to spend first before it can tax from you or from me, what does that mean, and what does that mean the national debt is? And so it changes, again, going back to the limits, the national debt not being a record of dollars borrowed that we have to pay interest on and that future generations owe. It's literally the opposite. It's the dollars we have in our pockets that is the asset, the financial asset of future generations. So again, the limit to how much you can spend is inflation and real resource limits. So not that dollar limit. So it is that paradigm shift. But there's a lot of places where this can go, and a lot of more questions than answers maybe that this all brings up. Like why are we issuing bonds? What is the role of interest rates? Why are we paying almost $1 trillion in interest today? Eating into $1 trillion is now being of new money, you can call it, is being created and spent, given to bondholders at 5% interest for the privilege of already having dollars. They get 5% more for the benefit of having dollars in proportion to how many they have. And that is supposed to be the Federal Reserve's tool to damp down inflation. But I think we need to question that by going back to looking at what are the operations, what's actually happening on the operational level, who's getting what money, and those are, in the end, political choices.
Yeah, speaking of, I mean, the inflationary limits, I'm kind of mind blown that that wasn't one of the first critiques brought up by Bernstein and the other people that you talked to in the film. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I have an economics degree, and it's a basic fundamental, part of economics that if you print too much, you can cause inflation. And the fact that they didn't mention that is, again, very confusing and seems like it would be a basic concept. And I'm glad that you acknowledge that you can't just print with reckless abandon without having consequences to that. What was the reaction then to this film and some of the concepts that were put out during a period where we are struggling a lot with inflation, right? I mean, there was a lot of money pushed out by the federal government during the pandemic. We hit a peak of somewhere between 9 and 10% of inflation during the Biden administration. It's come back down to around 3%, but people are still really struggling. So, I mean, how open do you think people are to a monetary theory like this when they're seeing the ramifications of that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that's why it's so important to tease out what does cause inflation and what were the causes of any specific inflationary episode. So going back to the COVID-19 pandemic or going back to the 70s or other, inflationary episodes, we have to look at what are the causes. Because I think it's too simplistic to say dollars go up, inflation goes up. The economy is more complex than that. There are different sectors. And so it's about spending. So when we look at the government, it's about what are they spending on? Are those resources available? If they want to spend on healthcare, if they want to spend on green energy, they have to go out and see, is the labor there? Do we have doctors and nurses to be able to hire, or is that going to drive up wages and prices? Or we have to look at sector-specific spending. And so what happened with the COVID pandemic, of course, was we had an increase in government spending, but that didn't necessarily mean that that was the cause of the inflation. So that just kind of filled out the huge drop in private spending that we saw right after COVID-19 hit. Government spending was able to come in and backfill that loss of private spending so that people didn't lose their jobs, didn't lose their homes this time as compared to 2008. And then the Fed itself and central banks around the world have done great analysis to show, what are the causes of this inflation? What are the sectors where we see the inflation occurring? And, in the U.S. it started with computer chips and shutting down car factories, and then the rise in used car prices because all of a sudden, you have the shortage of cars. And that was the first thing to hit the CPI or the inflation index. And that's a very specific cause, right? And so how do you address that inflationary pressure? Well, you have to look at the supply of computer chips. And that's actually exactly what the Biden administration did with the Chips and Sciences Act. They passed a bill to spend new money to address the capacity in this bottleneck, this supply, this kind of friction overheating we see coming from computer chips. So they said, we need to actually produce some computer chips here at home for strategic reasons. Today, they mostly all come from Taiwan. So they've invested now to produce more here so that we don't hopefully hit that inflationary bottleneck again. And so that's the counterintuitive way that we need to understand inflation is sometimes it takes additional spending if it's a supply constraint. And then with the rest of the pandemic, we did see other supply shocks. And so there's a lot going on there, but then you get into oil or energy with, the war in Ukraine, we saw a big oil price shock. How do you address something like that or something similar that happened in the 1970s? Well, you have to address the energy sector. The Fed, we've given all the power to, we've given them all the responsibility for dealing with inflation to the Federal Reserve. And they only have one tool. They only have the interest rate. And so that's all they can do is raise the interest rate to fight inflation, even if their own models, their own economists are telling them this is not going to be effective in this type of inflation and maybe is never effective for any type of inflation. They just don't have the empirical evidence. And you can ask them as well, show me the published papers that show that raising the interest rate is going to lower inflation. So there's a lot to discuss, but the main point is it's very important to look at what are the causes of the inflation, what are the myriad tools and policies that we can put in place to address that specific inflation, because otherwise you're not getting to the root of the problem, and we got to get to the root of the problem. And I think what MMT does is it centers inflation risk, takes it more seriously, says we need to be planning and preventing inflation before we spend, as well as employing tools after inflation pops up to prevent it. And centering that in their theory, it's not an afterthought, it's the center.
And something that's been essential among MMTers that I think has given them a lot of credentials at a time when everyone was questioning them. And I would say people were questioning the MMT community because, it does question the status quo in a major way. The tool of adjusting interest rates to manage the unemployed population has largely been used to keep wages down. And since NAIRU, which is the policy at the Federal Reserve, where they set this magic number that they think, unemployment should be at to curb inflation, Jerome Powell's admitted on the floor of Congress that they're getting it wrong, and they don't have evidence to back it up, and the relationship's not strong as it used to be 50 years ago. But since NAIRU was enacted in the 70s, that is really when we saw wages start to depart from productivity. And so, in part, this has been used as a tool to keep wages low that really benefits corporations. So when you say that actually isn't necessary to keep people unemployed and we can free up capital, we talk all about how there's gridlock in Congress and that's why not a lot gets done, but they're really leaving this power of the purse on the table by not moving in the direction that MMT lays out of, here are the real constraints of inflation. We've predicted recessions before based on this economic thinking. Do you think, the film is going to help people start take it seriously? Because it's kind of undeniable, even if you're not an economist, to watch the film and change your opinion.
So yeah, I think the basis here is that we are allowed to question economics, because I think a lot of these bigger questions actually are political questions around who gets what resources. And that's what economics comes down to. It's not really these natural inevitabilities that the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer. We've created this thing we call the economy. Humans create this thing we call money. It's an organizing tool for the real resources we have. And if we look at it that way, we realize that these are fundamentally public policy decisions, political choices that I think as voters in an economy we all need to have some basic understanding of in order to vote for what we want or the public interest that we want to prioritize. And so I hope that that's where it brings this debate, and it brings it to, a little bit more sophisticated and more serious debate around what can we really afford and what could we prioritize in terms of future generations, leaving them the real resources and the planet and a functioning economy that benefits us all would be the hope.
Maren Poitras, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be back with more Rising after this.